Today we are here to celebrate what many consider to be the best Final Fantasy in history. Final Fantasy IX.
Frankie's Lair.
Welcome to this brand new retrospective in the past of time. The last one I did was Lost Odyssey. Did you watch it? This retrospective I've been promising you for a long time, so get comfortable. Find a half hour or so to be comfortable, quiet, and listen to this beautiful story I'm going to tell you today, which is how Final Fantasy IX came about, what it represented at the time, what it represents today, and what it will probably represent tomorrow. Final Fantasy IX came out in Japan in July of 2000 and in America in November of 2000, but what really interests us is that it came out in Europe and therefore in Italy in February of 2001. A really troubled time in history to come out because the PlayStation 2 had already come out and the whole world was talking about the PlayStation 2. Because the next-gen thing is not something that came about with the PlayStation 5, it's always been there. And you have to know that when Final Fantasy IX came out, Final Fantasy X had already been unveiled. And despite this brutal situation in which it came out, it has managed to this day to be perhaps the most remembered Final Fantasy after 7 and 6, which is no small feat out of no less than 15 titles. You should know that the initial development plans for Final Fantasy IX did not happen after the release of Final Fantasy VIII, but almost in parallel with the beginning of the development of Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VII had been a success, an incredible success. It had sold more than 10 million copies. It had been a success of incredible proportions that had never been achieved before for the franchise. After a success of such great proportions, Sakaguchi, who was vice president of Square at the time, decided to split up the team, so half the team would be in charge of Final Fantasy VIII, mainly everyone who had already worked on Final Fantasy VII. So we're talking about Kitase, Nomura, Nojima, and company. But in the meantime, however, Sakaguchi had decided that the direction Final Fantasy was taking was not very much to his liking, because Sakaguchi was, after all, the father of Final Fantasy. And after seeing Final Fantasy 1 through 7 all super deformed, he was not very comfortable with this new, realistic style of Final Fantasy, although he understood that the market was turning in that direction and that therefore there was little he could do but let the course of things go. However, he still decided to get to work on a title that at the time was still not certain. Was Final Fantasy IX. Initially it was presented as a Final Fantasy Gaiden. It was still not certain, I remember, because back in the day on Console Mania I saw the sketches of these very early artwork of this hypothetical Final Fantasy Gaiden, and I thought it was Final Fantasy Tactics 2 because the style and the art design were very similar, and most importantly it was not futuristic at all. It went back to a medieval fantasy style, and since Final Fantasy Tactics was pretty much my favorite game, along with Final Fantasy VII and Xenogears, it seemed obvious to me that that could be Final Fantasy Tactics 2. And yet it wasn't, guys. It wasn't. Sakaguchi decided to develop Final Fantasy IX following his heart. He wanted to recreate the old school feeling of Final Fantasy 1 through 5. He wanted a medieval setting, he wanted a fairy tale, he wanted a compelling story, and very well characterized characters. So by his side to begin the writing of this adventure, he could only rely on Hiroyuki Ito, already director at the time of Final Fantasy VI. In short, he was not the last to arrive, and also the one who later devised the battle system of Final Fantasy Tactics. In short, a genius. A genius, you can't define it any other way. The world of Final Fantasy IX was not inspired by the old Final Fantasies, rather it was inspired by The Dark Crystal, an old fantasy film released in 1982. Actually, both in terms of the races, in terms of the views of the landscape, and also, this, I can't let you hear, the soundtrack of Final Fantasy IX is very reminiscent in the cinematics of the trailer of The Dark Crystal. However, as you know well, my friends, battles are not won alone, and therefore yet another party member was needed. I'm talking about the bard of the party, and it could only be him, the legendary Final Fantasy composer in Flesh and Blood, Nobuo Uematsu. He found the time because the soundtrack for Final Fantasy X was not composed only by him, but also by Masashi Hamauzu and Junya Nakano. The game took about 2.5 years to develop, and they even went so far as to change the ending 7 times. 7 times, guys. Even it was revealed that the monologue of the ending of Final Fantasy IX was supposed to be spoken by Kuja instead of Vivi. That would have been awesome, guys. I believe that the ending of Final Fantasy IX is beautiful, however. Unfortunately, like most JRPGs in those years, it too suffered from certain cuts and an unwarranted final rushes. Obviously, there is no tangible proof of this. However, friends, I played all the JRPGs of those years, and it happened mainly with any title, starting from Breath of Fire 3, Xenogears, even a little bit in Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII. Unfortunately, in those years, there you would start in one direction, then time was tight, and then tis you had to cut back. And unfortunately, Final Fantasy IX, you can see that it was cut and rushed in an unworthy way toward the ending in order to be able to release it by the 2000. And since he just appeared on screen, a little mention should be made of Transkuja, because he is one of the most beautiful characters in the Final Fantasy universe. And it certainly reminds of Super Saiyan 4 Son Goku and Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta. But more than that, it reminds me of a very dear friend who gifted me the most beautiful statue ever created from Final Fantasy IX, which depicts the very final confrontation between Jidan and Transkuja. Clearly, I am talking about my #1 follower and great friend LUCA PRONESTI. I had not yet found an opportunity to be able to show this masterpiece, and here it is. Boy, the details of this statue cannot be captured on camera. It should be observed in 360 degrees. What? Are you looking at that piece of iron? No, guys, you don't have to look. No, guys, the sword has nothing to do with Kuja. Look at Kuja. I lost you guys. Alright, so while we're at it, let's take a look at what's behind Kuja. The best Sephiroth statue ever made. The Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII Remake. 3 feet tall, wingspan of 80 centimeters. It is something that cannot be communicated in words or on film. It has to be seen in person. LUCA, I really don't know how to thank you. You have turned my living room into a museum. Anyway, back to Final Fantasy IX. To try to boost sales commercially, commercials were also made in collaboration with Coca-Cola. But despite that, the game only sold 5.5 million. At that time there, Sakaguchi was also trying his hand at that darned awful Final Fantasy movie, The Spirit Within, and so he couldn't direct Final Fantasy X. Therefore, it can be said that Final Fantasy IX was the last Final Fantasy with Sakaguchi's spirit branded into it. And this thing actually feels so much because then 10 dropped a lot of legendary mechanics like the ATB, the world map, and so many other things. but we are not here to talk about Final Fantasy X. The rumors are that in the company, Kitase gained a lot more luster from the top management of Squaresoft, and as far as there is no evidence, guys, the impression I personally got is that Kitase gained a lot more acceptance after the pseudo-failure of Final Fantasy IX sales. Then in short, the story of how Sakaguchi abandoned Square and founded Mistwalker, I told you in the Lost Odyssey retrospective. Therefore, friends, I urge you to absolutely go and catch it up. This whole introduction about the development of Final Fantasy IX is to invite you to reflect and become aware of how important Final Fantasy IX is today, because it is in fact the last true old-school Final Fantasy. The combat system of Final Fantasy IX is something that cannot be more classic. It doesn't invent anything. It draws from everything that had been seen in the series up to that point and decides to give it a little luster, a little polishing to create a battle system that worked perfectly. Because, as Sakaguchi taught us even in his later games, there is no need to necessarily invent something that doesn't exist and to necessarily abandon a model that has already been explored. If you ever take an already explored model that works, improve it. But there is no need to twist everything, because twisting everything so many times only means one thing for the fans: to find themselves bewildered and a deterioration. So guys, the battle system of Final Fantasy IX, I think, is the pinnacle of the saga, because it is true that the Materia system had been in its own way revolutionary and incredible. However, you lost the identity of the characters in battle. Each character was just like the other. Everyone could do everything. In contrast, in Final Fantasy IX, the roles, the classes, are well defined, but above all, the skill system drew a little from here and a little from there, but allowed you a configuration of characters that had never been seen before. In fact, you have to know that each piece of equipment contained latent skills that the character could use as long as they were equipping that piece of equipment. But then by fighting, they gained SP that allowed you at some point to learn, then keep those skills on you, and then you would usually proceed to equip the new piece of equipment to try to master as many skills as possible. But then it's not like you could equip them all at once. You had limited points to assign your skills. And so, depending on the situation and the boss, you clearly had to do a painstaking job of taking out the skills that you didn't need at that time and equipping the ones that you did need. It's natural that today, after all these years, I'm here talking about it as if it's the most logical thing in the world. But I can assure you that as a child, I actually hadn't explored that system very thoroughly. I had played it in a blind, very casual way, and so I had some very serious problems against the final boss. This I remember. What really makes Final Fantasy IX an out-of-the-ordinary game, though, are its characters. Because boy, even the most useless secondary character was characterized to perfection, much more than what had been seen in the last Final Fantasies. In a way, you could say Final Fantasy IX reminds much more of Final Fantasy VI than 7 or 8. This is true of the Tantalus, the gang of Jidan, the protagonist, who from the very first lines of the game gets into our hearts. Some of them then can join us as guest party members, and in fact we all may have wished we could have them permanently in the party, because characters like Blanc and Marcus have entered our hearts. But I think everyone will confirm that the two best characterized characters in the game are Vivi and Steiner. While Steiner is the classic soldier whose loyalty and faith resides blindly in his queen and country, so from the very first lines he will be very edgy. He will come across as uncomfortable in the party, because he will always try to row against what Jidan and company wants to do. He will always try to put a spoke in the wheel, and the classic character who will never change his mind puts a label on you. He has decided you are that. He comes across as very unlikable in the early game, however. Then at some point, he gets to thinking about the why, the how. He actually is loyal to the queen, of course, but he is also loyal to the princess. He loves Garnet. He just wants what is best for Garnet. That is why he initially opposes Jidan and his group with all his might. However, then as he goes on, he will realize that probably Garnet's happiness depends solely on what she wants, and this is also true for him, because at a certain point, he will realize that everything he believed in and what he fought for at that time was to be set aside to do the right thing, and therefore Steiner has a change of heart, repenting himself, and therefore he will become one of the party members that can be relied on the most. Actually, this change of heart in the game will happen several times. It will also happen to Beatrix, the shogun, the strongest general in Alexandria, who is encountered several times initially in the early stages of the game and who will always deck us. And she is basically the Orlando of Final Fantasy IX, and she too will have a change of heart at some point. Too bad that probably for shaved development, they forgot the most important thing of having her join the party. Luckily though, guys, there's a mod that's come out lately that implements her right into the story. So at some point, events way down the line in the game, she's gonna join the party and she's gonna have just the dialogues, the scripted dialogues in the game. It's just like she joined in the story. It's how it should have been. That's it. At some point, even Kuja, in the final stages of the game, has a little change of heart. It's a shame. It's a shame. I would have liked that phase of the game to be explored a little bit more, and instead, Kuja has time to say 2 or 3 lines, repent for everything he did, and then die in his brother's arms. And that's actually a very strong scene because Jidan always wants to help others. He's not so different from Goku, whether it's because of the tail or when he turns into trance and looks like a Super Saiyan 4. In short, Jidan is a good character, positive, and wants to help everyone. But the game also makes you realize that sometimes even Jidan has his own insecurities and inner weaknesses, and when that happens, he's going to take it really hard. That is, you feel almost distressed when you see Jidan wavering and doubting himself. But besides them, the one who really shines, most of all, probably is Vivi, the Black Mage. The Black Mage who accompanies our heroes from the very first seconds of the game. In fact, he will be the first controllable character. And this, I don't think, is a coincidence. They wanted to put a very strong asterisk that that character has to be followed. To be understood and to be loved. He is to be mourned. Vivi represents purity, naivete. He is newly born and has the will to live. He wants to explore the world. He wants to know. He wants to be friends with everyone, and he will make a lot of friends. Then at some point, Vivi will discover his origins. He will find out where he comes from. He will feel anguish for his people, his brothers who are chained to a fate that they did not ask for. Then we will find that some of these brothers have managed to escape, managed to find a reason to live, other than the fact that they were created to be weapons. I mean, only to find out that they actually have an expiration, a very short expiration. The first question that Vivi asks himself and asks Jidan is, will happens to me too? Will I also die? I mean, who knows? It's a very sad destiny. It's a very sad thing. It's a very sad thing that at the time it didn't affect me very much. Because Final Fantasy IX is a game that deals with some very mature themes as well. And it also depends, I guess, on the moment in your life in which you play it. But when I replayed it lately, I have to admit that I got a little bit teary-eyed. because he was the only one who just never hurt a fly. I mean, he didn't deserve it. He didn't deserve it. However, sometimes fate makes things happen that we don't deserve. What I did not find amusing, however, alas, was the implementation of two characters that might as well not have been there. I'm talking about Kina, who can be as likable as you want, but she could have easily been an NPC following the group that it would have been the same thing. And Amaranth. Amaranth, guys. I mean, Amaranth says 3 sentences in the whole game that makes no sense. He changes his mind overnight because he falls into a hole and breaks his leg, and otherwise he could have just as easily not been there. He served the stereotype of the lone wolf. He served the shadow of Final Fantasy IX. They implemented him, but you can tell they didn't have the time to write and deepen him down. This thing here, combined with the absence of Beatrix in the party, to me personally, it left a hole in my chest the size of a house. In order to be able to deepen the characters so well, they created the active time event system. It was a system that made events happen at the same time. Every time you came to a town and the party split up, a lot of dialogues that would have been difficult to fit into the main script were relegated to this system so those who wanted to deepen characters could watch those little scenes, while those who maybe weren't interested in following the events, the vicissitudes of certain characters, could just slap them together. Many people believe that the characters in Final Fantasy IX were drawn by AMANO. Actually, the characters were sketched by the entire Final Fantasy IX team, captained by Sakaguchi, and then they were actually drawn by Shuko Murase for the main characters and Itahana for the secondary ones. However, Murase was interviewed by Famitsu for the 20th Final Fantasy IX anniversary. The interview can be found in the July 2020 Famitsu. And only later, as a matter of promotional marketing, AMANO did draw his own versions. The fact that Final Fantasy IX came out so late meant that on a technical level, it was almost a PlayStation 2 game, and in fact the movies and cutscenes had a much higher level of graphic and direction, and it was a much more dynamic direction than what Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII had gotten us used to seeing. Unfortunately, it was quickly forgotten because it was covered up by everything on a directorial and cinematic level that Final Fantasy X showed us, because you have to admit that Final Fantasy X for the time was incredible. But actually, Final Fantasy IX too was also incredible, only unfortunately it went the way it did. One of the scandals that hit Final Fantasy IX the most was about the strategy guide. I would like to thank in advance the dear Eduardo Sprezante, who provided me with some material regarding the guides so that I could illustrate this nice trivia. The Final Fantasy IX strategy guide was involved in a scandal. In fact, it was an excuse to direct all players to the fledgling Play Online site, which was then the very first portal to register for Final Fantasy IX. Initially, that portal was not calculated by anyone at all, and so to force users to populate that site, they decided to put more than half a guide only online. So basically, every page of the guide tells you the bare minimum, and then there were these tiny little boxes that said, "Ha! Ha! Ha!" If you want to know more, go with this password to the Play Online site. But that forced you every couple of seconds to have to connect to the internet, log into a computer, enter the freaking password, read what you had to read, and then go back to play. I mean, you imagine that you are playing the PlayStation. You need the stupidest detail to go on and you can't. You have to pause, go turn on the computer, enter the freaking password. Guys, back in the day, we're talking about 2201. Back in the day, it wasn't like today. We didn't have smartphones. The internet was 56K or SDN, so the connection was very slow. The computer in the house very often was used by the parents for work. It's not like you just picked up and hooked up to the computer whenever you wanted. It wasn't like today. So it was a scandal, a very serious scandal, because as you see from the overlay images, the Final Fantasy IX guide was super thin compared to the guides of all the other Final Fantasies. It looked almost like a Marvel album, the weekly ones that come out 50 pages long. It was ridiculous. There were actually 180 pages inside. However, you have to understand that the average number of pages at the time was between 300 and 500. So really that guide was just a promotional ploy to force people to sign up for that damn play online. In 2016, Square Enix released a remaster of Final Fantasy IX for almost all platforms, but in reality, this version only had the models of the main characters redone from scratch, and the rest was the PlayStation version all blurred, all faded, minimal resolution, upscaled badly, which clearly looks unwatchable. There is a monstrous disconnect between the models of only the protagonists and the models of the NPCs, the models of the secondary characters, and the backgrounds. But fortunately, some heroes, as in the case of Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, upscaled everything, all the backgrounds, all the NPCs, all the monster models, and released it under the name Moguri Mod. Available only on PC with the Steam version. This allows you to play the game in 16 nuns with virtually 2K graphics, and the game is almost a PlayStation 2 game for all intents and purposes. In fact, it is even better than many PlayStation 2 games. They've done an incredible job, and plus, there's another change that will go to you to implement Beatrix in the scripted party in the story. The dream everyone had became reality thanks to them. This makes Beatrix fully playable towards the latter stages of the game. But more importantly, she has been included in the story, so if you take her with you, she will have her dialogues written just fine. What can I say, friends? We started this retrospective by saying that Final Fantasy IX is one of the best. Actually, I believe that there is no such thing as the best Final Fantasy. The best Final Fantasy is usually the first one you play, or the second one, or it is the one that accompanied us in some difficult moment of our lives, because then that is what JRPGs are all about. Finding friends who take you by the hand and lead you on a journey that very often is not only inherent to their story and their adventure, very often it is an inner, introverted journey that we also make, and thanks to which we can find a maturity that maybe normally we would not have found. Today, in the midst of my 39 years, I feel like a very changed and matured and grown person, mainly because of these great games, these works of art, these adventures, these parallel lives that I have lived in the company of so many characters, some characterized better and some worse. But in the end, it is not only what these games leave in our hearts. So I believe it when there are people who tell me that for them, Final Fantasy IX is the best ever, just as I believe those who tell me that about 10, 8, 7, 6, etc., etc., etc. If you have come this far, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. As always, I remind you that I have done a lot of retrospectives on Final Fantasy 6, 7, 8, Xenogears, Breath of Fire 3, and many more I will translate from Italian to English, but it will require time. If you appreciate this video and my work, you can support me by liking it, subscribing to the channel, sharing this video with all the friends you know, in all the Telegram groups you frequent, and if you want, you can also contribute a coffee to the livelihood of the channel. Because in any case, I remain 100% independent, and I can only afford to do what I do because of some of you who actively support my channel. If there is any other retrospective that you would like to see, please write it to me in the comments. The one that will get the most mentions, I will seriously consider doing. Otherwise, friends, We'll see you in the next video. Abayo.